coffee smoothie. So Luke. So people write biographies for different reasons. Usually they are convinced the subject of their writing ought to be introduced to so many people as possible. An effective biographer uses good sources and interviews people who can give first-hand account of events, words, and habits from the subject life. A good biographer presents an honest and full record of the subject impact on others. So the gospel writer Luke approaches tasks with each of these objectives. His opening verses describe in detail how he gathered his materials and why he decided to compose his biography of Jesus Christ. Written by Luke, approximately AD 60. The Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts were clearly written by the same individual, Luke. Chapter 1, verse 1, verse 4, Acts chapter 1. Although never identifying himself by name, the writer used a we in many sections of Acts indicates that the author was a close companion of Paul. Only Luke among the colleagues when Paul mentioned in his own epistles, Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, and 2 Timothy chapter 4:11, and Philip chapter 2, verse 4, fits the profile of the author of these books that agrees perfectly with the earliest tradition of the church. We're off to meet or attribute this Gospel of Luke. I think I'm going to read the Interversion one. Jesus, the Son of Man who lived. Yeah, let's read it down. So this one's called Introverts. So it says the history roots of the extroverted church. The roots of the BS toward the extroverted way of thinking and acting reach back into the history of evangelism. The evangelical movement in the United States traces in the origin to the Greek awakening of the 18th and 19th centuries. The winds of the 18th and 19th centuries, the winds of revival swept through Europe and North America, bringing with them an eruption of conversions and rediscovered religious zeal. The awakening gave birth to fresh commitment to obedience to Scripture, and they were frequently accompanied by physical and emotional experiences of God's presence. People gathered for worship and had personal experience of God's holiness, and many collapsed into tears or froze in silent awe, overfainted or trembled uncontrollably. So at the center of the first Great Awakening was George Whitefield, an English evangelist who preached in churches throughout the American colonies. Some people hiked for days to hear him, packing every venue. Church historian Mark Nahl describes Whitefield's highly introverted, extroverted preaching style. In the pulpit, he simply excluded energy. His speech was in the highest degree dramatic, and he offered breathtaking impressions of biblical characters and needy sinners and hired his listeners' imagination. He wept profusely often and with stunning effect. Even with these emotional displays, the First Great Awakening maintained a remarkable balance between heart and mind, owing largely to the genius and devotion of another prodigious figure of time, Jonathan Edwards, an introverted congregation pastor in Massachusetts. He was able to provide an intellectual framework for the emotionally charged revivals, recording the movement of God in the later penning a now classic book that defined and clarified the nature of the revivals. The religious affections. During the Second Great Awakening, the origin of the camp meeting or tent revival, people would gather under a tent, sometimes for days on end, to hear evangelists preach the gospel. These evangelists addressed their listeners with dramatic urgency and intensity, pressing on them an immediate need for a decision. People also responded with great emotions and sometimes in moderated displays of weeping or shrieking. But whereas the First Awakening led to the founding of several of the country's most elite colleges, such as Princeton and Dartmouth, the Second Great Awakening of the late 18th and early 19th centuries introduced an anti-electoral bent to evangelical Christianity, suspicious of a dry, lifeless, accompanied faith. The leaders of the Second Great Awakening phrases that conversion must be experienced in order to be authentic. Pity of the heart began to overshadow the understanding of the mind. A wedge was driven between emotions and the intellectual divide, and that would endure for generations of evangelicalism. I don't know why they gotta wait so long to fix the door or paint it. So weird. After the Second Great Awakening, many evangelical leaders and scholars learning a theological understanding together to point the 19th century evangelicals. So D.L. Moody boosted my theologically I didn't know I had any. What mattered to him, what mattered to them was a genuine inward devotion to Christ that expressed itself in a life of obedience. Scholar Gunnese explains that the Titan rivals, the forebears of 12th century evangelical crusades, featured props and other innovations that were even indicative of cultural progressivism. Americans valued hard work, common sense, ingenuity, and know-how, and did not have room or need for it in intellectual sophistication, abstraction, or for reflection. Evangelicals applied these approximate values to religion and began to focus on the visible effectiveness of their methods in the form of tangible, qualifiable results. Evangelicals, modern evangelicals, are the hearers of the theological values and practices of previous generations. We have received from our ancestors the bent toward piety and passion, as well as the tendencies toward anti-intellectualism and pragmatism. Piety and passion evangelicalism continues to be primarily a religion of the heart. Personally, piety, I don't know if I'm even saying that right. Personal piety can be a beautiful and transformative, but sometimes our commitment to a childlike faith leads us to having effusivistic spirit that is intellectually and emotionally simple, or historical roots in the Greek awakening have led to an emphasis on overt demonstrated experiential displays of devotion. The stress on the public expressions of faith can set up a false model for what all real spiritual experience would look like, and it contributes to our evangelical robustly. Henry Knowing's words about this are sobering. Sometimes it seems that our many words are more an expressions of our doubt than our faith. It is as if we are not sure that God's Spirit can touch the hearts of people. We have to help Him out, and with many words convince others of the power. But it is precisely this worldly unbelief which quenches the fire. Sometimes words are a verbal mask for a spiritual way. We might say the modern evangelicalism has a hearing problem, and we often preach before we seek to understand a situation or before we sit in prayerful silence. Our verbal effectiveness can be devolved into a breezy cliche, hollow sound bites, and repeated songs. Lich thing that don't honor the uniqueness, complexity, and beauty of each person. The anti-intellectualism and pragmatism. Though the intellectual climate of evangelism is changing, many remain skeptical of the role of the mind in the Christian faith and are suspicious of academia and the light learner institutes. anti-intellectualism and pluralism. Though the intellectual climate of evangelism is changing, many remain skeptical of the role of the mind in Christian faith and are suspicious of academic and elite learning institutions. I need to go out of town for a couple of days. Role of the mind in Christian faith and are suspicious of academia and elite learning institutes. Mark now summarized as part of evangelical culture. To put it most simply, the evangelical echoes is activist, populist, pragmatic, and utilitarian. It allows little space for the broader or deeper intellectual effort because it is dominated by the urgencies of the moment. The pragmatism that we have inherited fosters an action-oriented culture. Evangelism values the doer over the thinker. The evangelical God has a big agenda. It is as if moment we surrender our lives to Christ, we are issued a flashing neon sign that says go. There is a restless energy to evangelism that leads to a full schedule and a fast pace, and some have said that in the Christian culture, busyness is next to godliness, and we are always in motion, constantly growing, ever expanding. I'll never forget the statements a senior pastor of a 300-member congregation uttered when I interviewed foreign associate pastor Potion. This is a really high entertaining environment, and we're looking for someone who is excitable and high energy. You have to be totally sold out to work here, and we work full throttle. I double-checked my surroundings to make certain, and I was at a church and hadn't stumbled into an interview for the pit crew at the Indianapolis Speedway, and I would have laughed at his statements if I wasn't so mortified. I was reminded of Eugene Peterson and the Zeitment of our brand of Christianity. American religion is conspicuous for its missionarily precarious energy, its embarrassingly banal prose, and its impatiently hustling ambition. The innovations of evangelicals has shaped the landscape of American religious life in ways that testify to this motion, growth, and expansion. And we invented the religious 12th century landmark, the megachurch, an expression of the church that introduced the paradox of people worshiping together in anonymity. At its best, the church growth movement has reached thousands of people with the gospel and surely connected with the surrounding culture. At its worst, it has produced a superficial, consumerist mode of Christianity that has sold the gospel like a commodity. Many evangelical major churches, in their hope to create comfortable environments for seekers, have striped their sanctuaries and worship services of any sense of mystery. And the sacred, their fast-moving, high-production events may entertain us, and their avid deployment of modern technology may dazzle us, but many times they cannot help us hear the still small voice of God. The mega church has fed our American presumptions, supportations with size and slubbery, and some of the largest implications have come for our models of leadership. At the center of most mega churches is a big personality, a dynamic, larger-than-life pastor who is able to hold everything together with his charisma. Time magazine and various Christian publications now release lists of the most influential evangelicals, so fame and stardom perhaps crept into the evangelical culture as churches rushes to imitate the success of others. They go for what they think is the guaranteed recipe for prosperity, starting with finding a pastor with big presence and star power. Description of George Whiteford above might be description of the ideal candidate for an evangelical pastor, except for perhaps his profuse weeping from the pulpit. The implications for introverts. Not all pastors of megachurches are extroverts, though a recent Barna study of 627 senior pastors of Protestant churches found that 75% of them are in human limitations often lead to pastors' former congregations in their own image presented the picture of Jesus and of discipleship that matches their own patterns. It is not surprising that introverted pastors are prone to encourage extroversions in their churches. Even introverted pastors, though, feel the pressure to act like extroverts. A well-known pastor of a large congregation acknowledged that social interactions drain him and that he prefers not to be in spotlight. Yet the social demands of his job are staggering. He lamented that in his congregation he is expected to be the lead socializer, the first one on the church patio and the last one to leave. All the interviews I conducted with introverted pastors yielded one commonly. The coffee hour after worship is one of their least favorite hours of the week. They love their people, but after expending a tremendous amount of emotional energy to preach, they would prefer to disappear into their offices than mingle. A therapist I know who frequently works, it's what I like to do. I like to be in my room and be alone, away from people. Said that many of her introverted clients struggle to find balance in their lives and often wrestle with depression. It seems that many introverts pay a high cost to be in ministry, and they feel unable to meet the social expectations placed on them by their congregations, and they feel frequently lack intolerant boundaries to enable them to find rest and to recharge their introverted batteries. Because of these challenges, one friend who was part of a pastoral nominating committee observed that the group's unspoken mantra was, if your personality starts with the letter I, you need not apply. All of these factors of mainstream evangelicalism combine to create an environment that can be marginalizing and even exclusive of introverts. For example, the upfront pity of evangelism and the expectations for outward emotional displays of faith can feel invasive and artificial to introverts. And meanwhile, the anti-intellectual stream can alienate some introverted thinkers who find that their love of ideas, comfort, and solitude empowers of concentration translate into a life of external pursuits. Furthermore, the pragmatism that seeks measurable, tangible gauges for success strikes many introverts who appreciate death as superficial and over-insistent in our action-oriented culture does not always value people who are thoughtful and reflective. Versions of the word introvert are adonantly used in evangelical thought to refer to an ingrown, self-centered version of the church. An introverted church turned in on itself, preoccupied with its own survival, has rarely fulfilled the right to be a church for its denying major part of its own being. The extrovert God of John 3:16 does not begot an introvert people. There is a terrible tendency to make the gospel serve us, to use it as a protection against the realities of life, as though Christ died to preserve the status quo. But the introverted church wants to secure the church doors against divine surprises and unannounced entrances by the king. The exhibit direct command that God, the Great Commission to Matthew Jewish readers, may represent a challenge to the tendency toward introversion. The introversion that was an exception in the first century has now become commonplace in contemporary Western churches. To these writers and many as others, introversion is equally with disobedience. In their minds, the introverted version of the church lacks a missionary identity. It is self-preoccupied and exclusive, worried about polishing the walls that separate from the world. And therefore, the mark of this true people must obviously be extroversion. Without doubt, the nature of the church described by these quotations is a distortion of what Jesus had in mind when he called his followers to make disciples of all nations. A church that is self-focused and insular is a social club, not a church. While the authors are not referring to introverted individuals to apply the term introverted to this kind of church, it is only to heap coal on the fire of an already damaged introverted psyche. By way of an analogy, imagine if we were to critical the church as soft, domestic, and comfortable, and then we labeled it the feminine church. That would be insulting to women and to the feminine qualities in all of us. So to call the isolated church introverted only reinforces stereotypes that plague people who are properly called introverts. Further, I'm not convinced that the extroverted church would be any more faithful to the biblical vision if a church turning away from self-protection and parochialism committed itself to being an extroverted community. The opposite imbalance would easily occur. If we are broadly defining the extroverted church as outwardly orientated, then the wholly extroverted church is liable to lose its center, lapsing into spiritual compromise and excessive cultural accommodation. Just as a church that is turned in on itself is stunned, a community that is freely turned outward could lose its internal cohesion and disintegrate. Furthermore, as I will discuss, one of the ways we discover the compassion that lies at the heart of mission is to look inward. I believe that the truly healthy church is a combination of introverted and extrovert qualities that fluidly move together. Only in that partnership can we capture both the depth and breadth of God's mission. Introverted extroverts. So the marginalization of introverts in Christian communities is a relatively new phenomenon. When we consider the history of the church, there have been many periods in which solitary, contented believers have been among the most esteemed figures. In the 4th and 5th centuries, a group of men and women retreated away from the wealth and rotation of newly established Christendom, which was a far cry from the persecuted underground of the early Christianity, and moved into the Egypt desert. These spiritual refugees, known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, lived in radical solitude to do battle with forces of temptation and sin that besieged their souls. They sought unencumbered encounter with God through contemplation and unceasing prayer. Even though these monastics, from Greek for solitary, wanted to remove themselves from society over time, they became the conscience and the de facto moral leadership of the church. Eager apprentices from the cities followed them into their holes for wisdom and instruction, and even priests and bishops acquired after their counsel and blessing. Though they intently sought the isolation refuge of the desert, they came to understand their responsibility for teaching others, and they gave birth to the monastic communities committed to spiritual discipline, work, and mission through the devotion, and they actually changed the ecclesial structures of the church, formerly known for their auxiliary desert fathers and mothers, became revered for their holiness, humanity, and contemptuous knowledge of God. In our day, I'm convinced that introverts are an important ingredient in the antidote to what ails evangelism. Our slower pace of life, our thoughtfulness, our spiritual and intellectual depth, and our listening abilities are prophetic qualities for the evangelical community, calling us to a renewed understanding of God and a fresh reading on the abundant life Jesus came to give us. Yet because of an extroverted BS, in many of our churches, introverts are leading double lives. We are masquerading as extroverts in order to find acceptance. Yet we feel displaced and confused, and we are weary of fighting our introversion. And we long to live faithfully as the people we were created to be. Yeah, let me live how I want to live. It's my life, not your life. Not people. And not worry about what people think of you. The introvert difference. So this is a little thing right here. 3. He is not a man that is easy to draw out, though he can be communicative enough when a fancy seizes him. If I am to lodge with anyone, I should prefer a man of studious and quiet habits. I get in the dumps at times, and I don't open my mouth for days on the end, and you must not think I'm sulky when I do that. Just let me alone, and I'll soon be right. We all have 2 dead European psychologists doing in our heads in the early 12th century. Sigmund Freud and his disciple turn rival, Carl Jung, clash over the nature of introversion. For Fred, introversion indicated an unhealthy self-preoccupation. It was a pathological step toward narcissism, a disorder that involves obsession with the self to the exclusion of others, a habitual turning away from the outside world. The term narcissism originates from the Greek myth of Narcissus, who became enamored with his reflection in a pool of water. And one day, when stopping to take a drink, he caught a glimpse of himself in the pond and was entranced by his image. He became so obsessed with his reflection that he turned away from others, spurning the woman who loved him, including the nymph Echo, who, after this rejection, withered away in caves until she became a mere whisper. Unable to consummate his love with his own image, Narcissus stood immobile over his reflection for so long that he became part of the environment and turned into a flower. Narcissus rejected the world and the potential fulfillment in a healthy relationships, retreating into the gratification of his ego. Freud therefore chose the term narcissism to refer to this level of self-infatuation and world rejection. In Freud's perspective, introversion was a dangerous step toward narcissism, as it was the beginning of an exchange of eternal reality for internal fantasies. In Freud's view, if introverts have not yet become infatuated with their own image, they are certainly bending down to take a drink. But Carl Jung, in contrast, considered introversion a healthy and normal trait, part of his collective unconscious theory, which concerns the general psychological patterns shared by humankind. Introversion, a term he coined, was an introspective orientation, wherein a person finds primary energy within the self. Extroversion, on the other hand, is an outward orientation where an individual finds primary energy outside of the self in the surrounding world. Instead of claiming, as Freud did, that these tendencies merely resulted from family background and social constructs, Jung argued that these psychological types were inborn, whereas Fred posted a temporal dichotomy of normal and abnormal. Jung placed introverts and extroverts on an energy continuum, each being legitimate and healthy. In psychologically circles, Carl Jung has won the day. His collective unconscious theory is the basis of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, MBTI, a popular personality eventually inventory tool that breaks down preferences into 4 categories of opposite pairs. The first pair is introversion and extroversion. Regarding introversion, there is wide agreement that it is normal phenomena and healthy terminate, but in the minds of many introverts, the debate between Fred and Jung rages on, because our mainstream culture, even in our churches, praises the virtues of extroversion. Practically every introvert has agonized with questions like, is something wrong with me? The voices of others echo in our heads, sometimes with a frequency and volume that drown out our mind. Introverts are targets for a variety of misguided arrows, and we are shy, reserved, aloof, reclusive, and melancholic and self-absorbed, passive, timid, social rejects, and MISAN Thropes. And the list goes on. Psychologist Laurie Helgo says that we think of introverts as withdrawn, loners, quiet, and scared. We readily diagnose a preference for looking inward as stemming from depression, anxiety, or antisocial tendencies. But none of these are proper descriptions of the introverted temperament. These are distortions that result from other misunderstandings or our own confusion. Defining our terms, introversion and extroversion do not describe categories of people, but two separate forces within each person. Each person has a capability for looking outward at the world of people, things, activities, and events, as well as the capability for searching inward in the world of thoughts, feelings, imaginations, and ideas. All of our personalities move in these two directions. But while human personality is fluid, and our personality types seem to ebb and flow dependent on our context and circumstances, most people tend toward one sided of the conundrum. Introversion or extroversion is a preference, just like left or right handedness, and we will favor one over the other to varying degrees. With introversion itself, there is greatly variety. There is not an introverted mode, in as much as psychologically helps us. It's impossible to distill the full complexity and mystery of human personality into a list of characteristics. The degree of introversion is expressed. It is determined in part by our family and cultural backgrounds. Further, Myers-Briggs lists 8 different types of introverts depending on how they score in the other personality categories. Intuiting, sensing, thinking, feeling, and perceiving, judging. Introversion is one of a constellation of factors that fluidly work together to shape how we act. Introverts gather the information that feeds our inner worlds in different ways. Some rely on the concentrate experiences of their senses, and on the Myers-Briggs, while some depend more on the institution and interpreting what lies below the surface. Some introverts make decisions more from their hearts, and others more from their heads. Some prefer to structure their lives carefully, where others opt for more spontaneity and flexibility. Not all introverts will relate to every detail in the pages that follow. My own confession is that I score high on both the intuitive and thinking categories of the Myers-Briggs, and while I interviewed many people who fall into the sensing and feeling categories, I am not always able to isolate my introverted traits from other parts of my personality. There are 3 primary characteristics of introversion, and the first has to do with energy source. Given that we live in an finite world and have limited amounts of energy, where and how do we refuel? Introverts are energized by solitude. We are recharged from the inside out, from the forces of our internal world of ideals and feelings. Just as a gesture finds its power from a subterranean water source, introverts derive strength from hidden places, and we generally feel our energy tanks in private or in the presence of one or two close friends, or else in a public place without interacting with those around us. Some people misconstruct the introverted need for solitude as being antisocial. But it's not that we don't like people. It's that time with other people in the eternal world has a draining effect on us. And we don't avoid social situations like we would with a trip to the dentist, but sometimes we avoid them like we might avoid exercise because we lack the energy for it. And long periods without quiet refueling leave introverts feeling physically exhausted and emotionally hollow. At a recent conference for college students, I had the opportunity to pray for a number of people during a time of worship. Students cascaded to the back of the room to receive prayer for a deeply personal and sometimes agonizing identity and family and spiritual issues. I prayed for them with energy and compassion, but after about an hour and a half, as the stream of students flowed on, I was running on the fumes of my introverted fuel. My prayers became shorter and shorter and my words sluggish. I still looked like the same person. I still sounded like the same person, but somehow I wasn't. It was an introverted out of body experience, and the room began to lose its shape. And I can hardly remember who I prayed for and what we prayed about in the last 30 minutes of the night. So after the worship experience came to a close, the leaders gathered briefly. I regularly remember lying down on free padded chairs and curling into the fetal position. The next morning, my head pounded with the effects of an introverted hangover. I had overconsumed on eternal stimulation. Extroverts, on the other hand, derive their energy from outside of themselves and they need other people interaction and various kinds of stimulation in order to replenish their energy. They are like a reservoir that relies on rainfall for water, and they are refilled. They are refilled with eternal sources, and too much time alone, silent or inactivity leaves extroverts feeling drained. So my extroverted friend Justin slowly spirals into depression when his housemates are out of town, and at first he is filled with energy to accomplish neglected tasks around the house. But the solitude and quiet slowly taps his energy until, in his words, I become weird and neuronic. All I can do is watch TV and play computer games, and I lose the ability to speak in full sentences where that describes my behavior. And if I have spent too much time with people, Justin needs social interaction in order to feel normal. It is important to differentiate between energy source and energy level. People sometimes think of introverts as listless or despondent, the areas of the social scene. But it's not what we have less energy. It's that we lose it through interaction. We start to flag after an extended period without solitude. Depending on other personality and biological factors, we may charge to a high level, but we have a shorter battery life than extroverts. Further, many of us have learned to move and talk a little slower in order to preserve our social energy. Extroverts, likewise, can start with varying degrees of energy, even less than some introverts, but they will gain power from the outside world and leave with more than they came in with. Internal processing, the second classic mark of introversion, is internal processing. In our culture, we are continuously bombarded by stimuli in the forms of information, images, conversation, and a multitude of other data and experiences. In order for introverts' lives not to what's that word? Degenerate into disassociated states of confusion, we need to process these stimuli and integrate them into our lives. Another way that this integration process might be described is filtering. We need to filter in information and experiences, allowing the good to take root in us and transfer us, disgrading the bad or irrelevant. Introverted and extroverted filtration systems are different. Extroverts have flexible and processed filters that allow much to pass without getting clogged, and they can usually take a higher amount of stimuli before they become inundated. They mostly process internally through conversation and interaction with others. Talking is an integral part of their processing, and they often speak in order to understand. Their speaking and thinking occur simultaneously. Though they are capable of filter and reflection, they are most alive when engaged in the world of people and activity. This tendency lends itself toward a trial and error learning style as they depend on internal feedback to grow. Their outward filtering is done not only with words but also with their bodies. So extroverts may be more physically expressive than introverts. The introvert filter, on the other hand, is much finer and more rigid, only able to allow small amounts of stimuli to pass before it backs up. Introverts process internally in the workings of our own minds. We integrate and think silently. Ideally, we like to be removed from internal stimuli in people in order to process. Our thinking precedes our speaking, which means we will often pause as we reflect and carefully choose our words. This tendency can be exasperating to some extroverts who may find themselves wanting to finish our sentences. Though we are capable of engaging in the world, we are most alive in the reflections of our minds, marring over concepts and experiences. Our learning style centers around observation and compensation, and we are not as dependent on internal feedback for growth. Many introverts do not do well with interruptions, either when we are speaking or reflecting, because we draw conclusions before speaking. Interruptions disrupt our train of thought and force us to process newly present information before responding. Introverts may become even more frustrated when people mislabel their internal processing. One of the big mistakes extroverts make is to assume that if someone is not engaged with another person, that individual is simply not busy. So it's okay to interrupt someone sitting and reading because that person is probably reading only because there's no one else with whom she can talk. You can only imagine what an extrovert thinks of someone who is sitting there not even reading but merely reflecting. Clearly, that person needs to be put to some more useful tasks, such as listening to the extrovert's thoughts at the moment. When the finer filters of introvert become clogged in the presence of people, we often go silent. Though we may appear composed on the outside, our minds are in a state of constant activity. And when important or difficult information comes our way, our ideas swirl in our heads, in a hurricane of mental activity while our faces show no ripples. One friend, a pastor of a large Presbyterian church, said no ripples. One friend, a pastor of a Presbyterian church, said when she was young, she was surprised to hear her mother describe her as quiet because it was never quiet in my head. When this filtration process independent, the result can be irritation and confusion, or for me, temporary depression, which is even more confusing because I can start attributing those feelings to a spiritual cause or other sources. My introverted engine once dramatically broke down after 2 consecutive weeks of student conferences. The first week was a summer conference filled with 18 hours a day of Bible study skits, SCAF meeting and groups meals, pastoral interactions with students virtually, non-stop conversations, and communal sleeping and arrangements. It was a glorious week of seeing the work of God in an introvert's nightmare. After this taxing week, we began a second 5-day retreat to reflect on the completed school year into the vision that accompanied year. All that I wanted to reflect on was the softness of my pillow. Two days into the second retreat, my filter was really clogged, filled with the bitter, moldy grounds of the last week and a half, and then I was in a full introverted malaise, internal stimulation, and fluctuation and troubling over me. Though I managed to keep my composure during the day, at night, in the safety of my apartment, I fell apart. I spouted to my wife, "I'm not going back. I hate my job. I can't do this anymore. Why in the world did I take this job anyway? Why didn't you stop me? What was God thinking anyway?" Adam as a college pastor, lunacy. At 2 a.m. the night I walked through the apartment grounds, I seriously considered resignation. It's amusing to look back on those moments of despair when I was screaming, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I realize now I was not experiencing spiritual delusionment, but simply introvert overload. Fortunately, I have a patient wife and friends who help me through the time prescribing rest and solitude. I was also relieved. I recently discovered that other introverted ministers have had prayer experiences. Seeing a veteran minister told his own story of leading a week-long conference, and he began his week full of energy, insight, and compassion. But as the week granted on his balloon deflated, by Thursday he was impatient, tired, and depressed, and little things began to gnaw at him. And what were gentle interactions with students earlier in the week became shorter and sharper. Unlike me, however, Sean was able to diagnose the source of his condition, and he avoided falling into despair. For him, this was not the onset of a dark night of the soul, but merely a sign, directing him toward an attendant afternoon nap. Sometimes he would even check into a hotel for a night after a conference to avoid taking out the frustrations of his introverted overload on his family. For introverts, self-understanding can prevent disasters. The combination of solitude and internal process means that many introverts are more oriented toward ideas than they are interacting with people. We may be thinking about people, but we are often doing so while removed from conversation with them. Introverts, especially those who are score high in the thinking category of the Myers-Briggs, treat our ideas like friends, devoting the same energy and time to them. Likewise, we consider books and authors as mentors or as midwives to our most profound ideas. While extroverts may gauge their day by the quality of interactions and experiences they had, introverts often gauge their day by the thoughts and reflections they had, and we may even enjoy reflecting on our experiences more when we enjoy the experiences themselves. Likewise, we consider books and authors as mentors as our witness. Death and breath. A third distinctive of the introverted temperament is the preference for death over breath, and this applies to various aspects of our lives. Introverts tend toward high degrees of intimacy in our relationships, which we usually have fewer of the extroverts. Introverts are rarely contact with the surface level relationships and do not generally consider our acquaintances to be friends. We may find small talk to be disagreeable and tiring because we often prefer to spend time in one-on-one interactions rather than a group socializing. Our relationships can run deeper. Introverts also prefer to have a depth and fewer interests. This trait is connected to our style of processing. A breadth of information about a wealth of topics often results in introverted filter overload. Instead, introverts prefer to invest our energy resources into a smaller number of topics or activities. We desire to mine them for all their richness, to explore all their nuances and complexities. This commitment to specialization of enterprise, along with our love of ideas and our powers of concentration, explains why many introverts thrive in lives of scholarship. Our passion for depth also applies to our understanding of ourselves, where for extroverts, there may be no limit to the breadth of experiences and acquaintances they can have. For introverts, there is no end in our journey of self-discovery. Introverts are experts in our internal world, aware of the strata of motivations, feelings, and assumptions that determine our choices and behaviors. Here is a summary of common attributes of introverts. We prefer to relax alone or with a few close friends. We consider only deep relationships as friends. And we need to rest after outside activities, even ones we enjoy. We often listen but talk a lot about topics of importance to us. We appear calm, self-contained, and like to observe. We like to tend to think before we speak or act. And we may prefer a quiet atmosphere. That's why I bought the white noise machine, because for my reason. We need to experience our minds going blank in groups or under pressure, and we don't like feeling rushed. We have great powers of concentration, and we dislike small talk. We are territorial. We desire private space and time. We may treat their homes as their sanctuaries. Like me. May treat their homes as a sanctuaries. Prefer to work on own rather than with a group, and we may prefer written communication. And we do not like to share our private thoughts with anybody. That's why we always need privacy. Because introversion is not synonymous with shyness or aloofness. True introverts are harder to identify than you might think, and you can't always look for wallflowers or people staring at their feet to determine who the introverts are. Healthy introverts are not recluses just because we are oriented toward our inner worlds. Does not necessarily that we live in a private world devoid of social contact and activity. It means that whatever context we are in, we're predisposed toward what is happening inside of us more than we are in what is taking place around us. Introverts can be in an unruly crowd, still immersed in our interior worlds. Um, Introverts can be exclusive in social settings depending on their comfort and energy level into a situation. If you ask different people acquainted in various capacities and contacts with a particular introvert, you may get a very different perceptions. Some might say he is cold and distant, but others might say he is a warm and outgoing. In most situations with our close friends, I am usually among the crowd laughing and talking much closer to the center of attention. And my wife Lindsay, on the other hand, usually finds one or two close friends, sits in one place away from the action and has attended conversations with them. Most of our friends would say she is an introvert and I am an extrovert, but in situations involving strangers or acquaintances, I'm either posted at the fringes of the room, or I'll sit in among a group of people listening and only interfering, contributing to the conversation. Lindsay, on the other hand, is floating through the room and striking up conversations. Regardless of the social context or true temperaments, are always revealed in a trip home. Lindsay drives because I am too exhausted and she wants to retell her conversations and summarize what happened. This is the conception of her experience. Meanwhile, I sit next to her with my eyes half open and my head firmly planted on the areas. I try usually unsatisfactory to make active listening sounds. I'm either half asleep or else suddenly processing all the interactions I have had, and this is the complexion of my social experience. My energy is diverted while hers continues to build. Introversion is not a mere social construct or learned behavior. There is increasing evidence that introversion is a hardwire into our brains and that it appears at a very early age. Tragically, psychologists have identified introversion by its behavior pattern and symptoms, but with techniques for mapping the human brain have come to understanding that introverted and extroverted brains work differently. Our different behaviors and tendencies are expressions of psychological and chemical variations. We not only exhibit introverted behaviors, but we are introverts. Physiologically speaking, we can say that we are created as introverts. When our Creator knit us together, He shaped our brains in such a way that we would find satisfaction in reflection and comfort in a solo calmer life. So I'm more calm, quiet, and only like to talk to a few people, like just one at a time. And I hate drama. Like, drama is like horrible. You don't see me like starting drama with anybody. I just sit and mind my business. But people sometimes start drama because they want to try the quiet ones, and they want to see how they will react. That way you can just, maybe they think they can take advantage or try to walk over that person because they're quiet. But that's not true. So the studies of the human brain have revealed three significant psychological differences between introverts and extroverts. First, introverts have naturally busier, more active brains than extroverts. Though introverts look calm on the surface, our brains are bubbling with activity, and thus we require less external stimulation than extroverts. Too much external stimulation, in fact, leads to a feeling of overwhelm. Second, blood flows in different paths in introverted and extrovert brains. Introverts have more blood flow, but it flows in a longer, slower path than in extroverted brains. And the blood in introverted brains flows to sections that are focused on internal things like remembering, solving problems, and planning. On the other hand, the blood in extroverted brains goes to those parts that are used for the processing of sensory experiences of what happened internally. For introverted and extroverted brains have different chemical balances. The activities of our brains are catalyzed by neurotransmitters, which are chemical substances that transmit nerves and pulses. Extroverts require greater amounts of dopamine, essential nourishment, and a stuff about the nervous system. It's produced when people are active in motion. As psychologist Arthur Mighty Olson Laney writes, extroverts feel good when they have places to go and people to see, probably because they are flush with dopamine takes a short path through the brain and in stressful situations produces an act and react response. It can be credited for extroverts' ability to think and speak quickly and to thrive under pressure. It also helps them access their short-term memory rapidly, so the data processes circuit and shorter and faster. Introverts, on the other hand, require less dopamine, and when our brains have too much, we feel anxious and overwhelmed. Our brains rely more on another neurotransmitter, neurotransmitter of the third. I don't know that word. P1. Nervous system, which conserves and restores energy, producing a rest and repose posture. It produces a pleasure, a sensation in introverts when we are thinking and reflecting. However, cuts a longer path through the brain, which explains why introverts may have difficulty accessing words or memories quickly, and why we may be slow to react in stressful situations. Introverts often prefer writing to speaking because writing uses a different neurological pathway in the brain than speaking does. Additionally, the slower triply may produce a posture of calmness in introverts and cause us to move more slowly than introverts, which may explain why we are often less expressive with our bodies. I have come to see that this information is valuable in combating the common feeling among introverts that we are not as smart as others. For me, this insecurity used to surface every time I saw a spy movie with my introverted friends before we even decided the theater. My friends would be reviewing the movie, grappling with its plot twist and misdirection, and they could summon memories of detailed scenes and conversations quickly and make connections that I couldn't see yet. I felt slow and dense. I assumed that mental quickness was a barometer of intelligence, and I have come to understand the difference in introverted and extroverted brains. I have realized that it is not a matter of intelligence, but of different mental processes. I would often miss details in the movie because I would be more attuned to my internal state than the events on the screen. I also didn't have the accelerated access to my short-term memory, so as we reviewed the movie, I couldn't remember the scenes and plot twists as quickly, nor could I talk about it at the same rate. I needed time to process internally, which was hampered by the fast talk environment around me. After I had time to process it and reflect on it, I came not only to understand the overall plot, but often would see intersections and connections that would interact friends and miss. My clear lifetime memory enabled me to ruminate on the details of the movie after others had forgotten them. Echoes of introversion in the Bible. The Bible does not directly address personality categories such as introversion or extroversion. In order to be good interpreters of Scripture, we need to attend to the original history, culture, and literary context that is written in it. And 4, I am hesitant to superimpose a psychological grid onto the Bible, which would have been completely foreign. I am hesitant to superimpose a psychological grid onto the Bible, which would have completely foreign to the original writers and readers, so what follows are only suggestions or hints at the personality features that echo in the stories of biblical figures. Jesus' closest disciple in the gospel missions, first apostle Peter, stands out as a man with highly extroverted tendencies, and Peter was upfront and aggressive, quick to speak and quick to act. He planted himself at the center of the group of disciples, bluntly spoke his mind, and learned by making mistakes. He was the first to confess Jesus as the Messiah. And he was also quick to rebuke Jesus when Jesus said that his own messianic journey would go the way of the cross. Showing a tendency to act before thinking, Peter climbed out of the boat to meet Jesus in the waves and then reconsidered and sank. He was courageous enough to stand up on the day of Pentecost and preach the gospel to thousands of Jews, seemingly without having previously reflected on his message. Peter was bold and active, taking center stage in the gospel mission. I have wondered whether the Gospel of Mark, which is tragically attributed to a writer who accompanied Peter and recorded what he said about Jesus, is an action-packed as it is because of Peter's extroverted influence. Mark's story flows quickly, punctuated by sharp narrative introductions and sudden entrances of new characters. On the other side, there are several biblical characters that show signs of introversion. Jacob, patriarch of the nation of Israel, was described as a quiet man in Genesis chapter 25, verse 27, and Moses, when he was alone in the wilderness, encountered the God of his ancestors. He had resisted the God's call by saying he was slow of speech. Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. And worry of the spotlight. Mary, the mother of Jesus, showed a reflective, introspective side as she treasured all the things in her heart. Luke chapter 2, verse 51. Another Mary, Martha's sister, chose to sit at Jesus' feet and listen to him when he dined in their home. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. Verse 42. Then there was Timothy, whom the Apostle Paul felt the need to remind that the Holy Spirit is the one of power and not of timidity. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. Perhaps because Timothy let an introverted cautious turn into fear and passivity. And finally, there was Zadarius, and we might strain our necks as a bit to note that Luke's famous tax collector didn't utilize his short stature to maneuver his ways through the crowds to be near Jesus, but instead he climbed a tree to observe. Luke chapter 19, verse 2, verse 10. His first inclination was to consider Jesus from a distance, and he seemed content to let Jesus pass without interacting with him. Unlike more aggressive biblical characters, Zadarius waited for Jesus to interact with him rather than pushing his way through the crowd to touch or talk to Jesus. Although we do not know enough about most biblical characters to say definitely what their personality types were, we can say without hesitation that God used people of all different temperaments to carry out his mission to the world. God does not seek to conform them to a particular mode, but he works within their unique personalities and utilizes their individual gifts both to bless them and to bless others. Hey guys. So remember to not to let nothing distract, but to focus on Christ and not the negativity. People that want to start drama, there's nothing but trouble. Don't have no better thing to do with their life but cause trouble for others and try to get that person to react to their negativity. It's all psychological issues they have. And I'm not going to react to no negativity. If somebody bothers me enough, I'm going to report them. And I'm going to record the receipts. I'm going to expose them and make them famous on the internet because they think they're so powerful, like being negative to the other person, but they're the ones that have the problem and got something wrong with them inside of them. God called me to be a woman of God, to be gentle and silent, and to not be all loud and crazy, wild, using language in a profanity way and being like some of them young women act, all loud and flighty and being abusive and cussing and doing all types of stuff that's not good. They're just dramatic. It's like the hood rats. I am not like that. I'm just a calm person. I'm just calm and laid back and just chilling. But anyway, I want to start Luke tomorrow, guys. And I was reading this book, Introverts in the Church, Finding Your Place in Extroverted Culture.